We are starting out with just a clear scene, and we are going to start out by adding in a Partigon emitter. And this time we're going to use the effects browser. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the effects browser button, and we can create our Partigon emitter just by selecting Add Partigon Emitter. And now it has added that into our scene. And now we notice that we have a panel open that is called Effects Emitter, which is going to be the options for our current item, Particle Emitter, Partigon Emitter. And now, typically I don't like to work with this panel, and we can easily access this through the Object Properties. And I find it easier to work with Object Properties panel because we can switch through different options a little bit easier and then make different adjustments if needed. So I'm going to go ahead and open that now. Shift-O to open up Objects, or select our objects, make sure our Partigon Emitter is selected, and then we can go to Properties or hit P on the keyboard. This will open up our Object Properties, and if we select our Dynamics tab, we can see that one of the dynamics that is added is our Effects Emitter. And now we have the same panel that we just had open, except we're within the Object Properties, so we can easily switch between each of the different tabs and make adjustments, which I think is a little bit easier than using that other pop-up panel which is available. And let's take a look at some of the different ways we can manipulate these particles directly within the particle emitter itself and not using wind or gravity. The first option we see under Generator is the Group option. When it's set to default, as it is right now, it's going to apply to everything. In other words, it's part of every group. And we're going to focus on that a little bit later once we start adding in collisions, wind, and gravity. And then you can see how these groups are going to be extremely important when you're working with dynamics. Right now we're going to leave it at default because we don't really have anything else in the scene, and we don't need to worry about setting up groups. Our next option is the birth rate. And basically, this is in direct relation to our generate by, which is currently set to seconds. We also have frame, speed, collision event, wind, and wind speed. With seconds, it's going to generate 100 particles per second. So once we get to frame 60, 2 seconds, we're going to have approximately 200 particles in the scene. Right now we can see that we have 183, so it's not exact, but it is fairly close. Now I want to extend the amount of time we have in our animation. So if we go to the lower right, I'm going to set our time frame from 60 frames to 300 frames. And that way we can have something a little bit longer and a lot more particles in the scene. Now at this point, with our default settings, once we hit frame 60, the particles are going to start to disappear. And that's based on the option we have in the Particle tab, which is our lifetime frame. So right now, by default, it is set to 60 frames. So once each particle has been in our scene for 60 frames, it will disappear. And we can see that happening within our emitter box. I'm going to go ahead and zoom into this, and we can see that a little bit better. Once we hit 60 frames, we can start to see them kind of just fading in and out. So I'm going to change our lifetime to 300 frames. So now each particle is going to last 300 frames, and that's throughout the duration of our animation. If we were to set this to 400 frames, then we would notice that when each particle reaches its 300 frame lifetime, it will disappear. I'm going to go back to our generator, and we're going to take a look at a couple of other options. We also have generate by frame. And now if I scrub through, we're going to see that basically all of our particles will be emitted very quickly. And with the default amount, it's going to be set to basically frame 0. If we turn on fixed on the bottom, we can set a start frame. So if I want the particles to start emitting at frame 30, we can change that to 30, scrub through our animation, we will not see any particles until frame 30. Keep in mind we can also use this with our second generate by. So now we're not going to see anything showing up till frame 30, but they're still being generated by second and not by that frame amount. We can also generate by speed, collision event, wind, and wind speed, and we'll get into that a little bit later. First I want to show you just some of the more major tools you're going to be using and some of the more common settings that will end up being used when working with particles. I'm going to turn off that fixed amount, which is going to have us start out with frame 0. Also keep in mind, with fixed we can start out in earlier frames. So if I want our start frame to be -60, it's going to start out 60 frames before frame 0, and we can already see particles in the scene, and then we will start to hit that 300 frame limit barrier, and we'll start to see our particles disappearing. Turn off fixed, and let's take a look at our nozzle type. By default, our nozzle is set to sphere, and as we create our particles we can see that they are being generated within a sphere. Now we don't have any motion set to these particles, so they're basically just being created within the box and staying exactly where they're at. There's no motion right now on them, but we can see that generator and the nozzle shape, and it is a sphere. So let's take a look at some of our other options. We also have a box. So now if we generate, we will see it filling the entire bounding box within that shape. We also have a cone, and at this point we're really not going to see that showing up too much just because we don't have any motion in our scene or anything really applied to our particles to make them move in different directions. Now there's a lot of different objects and nozzle types we have available. We can also set this to object vertices, object normal, and parent collision and emitter, and we'll be going into those a little bit later. Basically, our object vertices, normal, surface, and line are going to be based on an emitter that is directly linked to an object. So in other words, having an object be emitter and not just an emitter by itself. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later once we go through some of these other settings. And the parent collision and emitter end we'll also be taking a look at, which has to do with working with multiple dynamic objects and multiple particle objects, and also in their relation to different collisions and how we parent each of the objects to each other and work with a hierarchy. I'm going to change this back to sphere, and we can see that animation, just those particles being created. And let's take a look at our generator size. And this will give us the ability to change the size of our emitter. Right now, by default, we have a box that is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. Let's go ahead and change our X to 5 meters, keep our Y at 1 meter, and our Z will set to 5 meters as well. So now we have a little bit of a wider box, and we can see all of these particles being generated within that. If I use the scroll to change between our different manipulation options, which we can also see by going to animate, in our animate tab, we can go through move, rotate, size, and stretch. Now we can see our scale is set to 1, 1, 1, even though our generator is set to 5, 1, and 5. And now it's really going to be easier to set your generator size within the object properties rather than going into your scale and modifying your object that way, because you can run into some issues and some problems with the overall particle generation if you're going to be modifying the size of the object outside of your generator size. So we do want to make sure that we're manipulating the generator size within the object properties and the effects rather than directly within layout. And the next option I want to take a look at is located underneath our generator size, and that is the particle limit. Now this is going to be in direct relation to our birth rate. So we're generating 100 particles per second. But once we reach 1,000 particles, it is going to stop generating. Now because our birth rate is generally pretty low right now. I'm going to go ahead and increase this up to 300. So now it's going to generate around 300 particles per second. We're going to scrub through our animation, and now we can see once we get a little bit past frame 100, we no longer see particles being generated in our scene. And that's because our particle limit is set to 1000. So once we reach those 1000 particles, it's not going to create any more. I'm going to add another 0 to increase our particle limit to 10,000. And now if we scrub through, we will see that our particles will be created throughout the lifetime of our animation up until we reach the 10,000 particle limit. Now also keep in mind that this particle limit is limited, which means we can only go as high as a certain value. I'm going to type in a really high number, just a bunch of 9s, and hit enter, and now we can see that it has stopped and gone down to 1 million. So we have a max amount of 1 million particles per Partigon or HV emitter object. So we do need to keep that in mind when we're working on different effects. If we need large amounts of particles, there are other methods we can use to generate those extra particles if we need that within our scene. I'm going to set our particle limit back down to 10,000. And we can see that there's two more effects that I have not covered yet, and that is our key effect, which gives us a key env, basically envelope, and parent key, and also our size effect, which will adjust the size of our particles throughout the scene with a variety of different options. I'm not going to go into that just yet, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. But right now, for the basics of our particle effects, we really don't need to worry about those settings. And let's go ahead and take a look at some of our motion options and a lot of the other effects we have available to modify the particles without using wind or gravity. So the next tab we're going to go into is our particle tab. And now we have a couple of different options here. We have the particle weight, which is going to affect its influence with wind, and also a lot of our other motion options. We also have the resistance, which we kind of took a look at before, in how we have our particles kind of slowing down and stopping once it reaches a certain point. And we've already taken a look at the lifetime frame. Now right now we're not going to see the effects of weight or resistance within our scene because we don't have any sort of force controlling the direction of our particles. I'm going to go back to the generator tab and just set our generator size back down to 1 meter on the X, Y, and Z axes. And now if we select the motion tab, we can take a look at the different forces to control our particles and their motion. On top, we're going to notice that we have a world coordinate system and also the local coordinate system. So we can easily switch back and forth between whether or not we want to work with local particles or local coordinates or world coordinates just by selecting that option. Our top, we are going to see velocity with a percentage, and basically this is our global velocity, which is going to control most of our settings underneath this. First, let's take a look at velocity, and this is going to be by millisecond. And we have X, Y, and Z, and each of these also has envelopes and also texture amounts that we can set next to them. So first, let's take a look at velocity, and using the velocity on the X. I'm going to set this to 2 meters. And now, just on the X, we're going to scrub through our animation. And we can see that all of our particles are now moving along that X axis, and then also stopping once it reaches its resistance amount, which is currently set to 1 meter, or just a value of 1. Go ahead and set our X to 0, change our Y to 2, and now we can take a look and see our particles moving along the Y in the positive amount. I could change that to a negative value, so I can do -2, And I do want to change what I said. It is actually going to be meters per second and not millisecond. So it is meters per second, and we have velocity of -2 meters per second, and that is the rate of our current velocity. Realistic gravity, we would set -9.8 meters per second, and that's going to give us actual gravity amount. Of course, without the resistances of wind and other effects in our scene, that would of course change that amount. Now I'm going to change this back down to -2. And keep in mind we could also set this to the z as well and have our particles moving on the z-axis. If we scrub through, we are seeing that our particles are eventually stopping, and that has to do with our resistance, which we'll go back to in just a second. I'm going to change our x to 2, so now we have velocities going on 2 different axes, and we can see them going slightly off to the side. And that way we can easily control that velocity on different axes. But of course, this isn't always the best way to control your particles. It just depends on the complexity of the dynamic object that you have in the scene. I'm going to set this back down to 0, set our y to 2 instead of the negative, and we're going to take a look at the resistance option, which is in the previous tab. So now we see that our particles will slow down and eventually stop. If we go to our particle tab and we set our resistance to 0 and now scrub through, our particles are going to continue along that velocity and not slow down at all. We can increase that resistance to 0.5, and now we're going to see them travel a little bit farther before they eventually slow down and stop. So let's set that resistance back up to 1. And now we can also take a look at particle weight. Our weight is currently set to 1. Let's go ahead and set this to 2. And now we can scrub through, and we're going to see that the weight is going to affect the force more. So the higher the weight we have, the more influence the different forces we have on our particles are going to be influenced within the scene. So if we change our particle weight to 4, now as we scrub through, we're going to notice our particles are even more influenced by that velocity change before we start to see them slow down because of our resistance. We can also see there's an option underneath the main option for each one of these different settings. Lifetime, also resistance, size, and weight. And this is going to be our variable. This allows us to customize each of these values so that it's not constant for all of our different particles. I'm going to set our variable to 1 for our particle weight, and now what we're going to see is that some of our particles are a little bit slower than the others, and we have just a little bit of variation in our scene. And to see this a little bit better, I'm going to change that for our resistance and set that to a value of 2 as our variable. And we're going to notice that some are going to slow down quicker than others. Go ahead and zoom out so we can see that a little bit better. And we have some of them carrying forth and continuing, and also some of them slowing down and stopping. So we can adjust the overall variance of each of these options with the second box that is available underneath. As I decrease our particle weight, we can see that effect a little bit higher with our overall resistance. If I set this down to 0, we're going to be back where we started. So we can also do this with lifetime as well. If we wanted some of these particles to disappear a little bit quicker, set that to 100. And now if we watch, some of our particles will start to disappear a little bit earlier or last a little bit longer. So we have all of these different options available for that. And also we have the particle size. Now this really isn't going to show up too much right now, and we'll go into that a little bit later. I'll just set our value to 0. Let's go back into our motion options and take a look at other ways we can affect the object directly. I'm going to turn off our velocity for the time being, and we're going to take a look at some of these other options that we have on the bottom, and we'll also take a look at the target option after we cover some of these other settings. One option we already kind of took a look at is the explosion. Go ahead and set that to 3, and what we're going to see is our particles expanding throughout and expanding outward from our central generator. Go back to particle resistance, and I'm going to reduce this to 0 so that we can have a continuous amount of particles flowing, and that way they won't slow down, and we can just see that nice explosion. Kind of a neat effect. Our next is vibration. And now, with our explosion set to 3, we can also have these particles break up a little bit more, and we can add a little bit of turbulence directly to our explosion effect that we currently have. So I'll set our vibration to a value of 1, and now if we start to scrub through, we can see that our particles are going to be moving slightly. And I'll increase that vibration value up to 3. And now we can see these particles are going all over the place. And we just have that nice bit of vibration, which controls sort of the variation of the direction of our particles. And it will break them up also as well. If I remove the explosions, we're just looking at vibration, we can also see that it will expand as if the explosion is on, and break up our particles. So it's kind of a cool effect. Underneath vibration we have vibration minimum, which is going to be the minimum amount of vibration. So if we want to set this a little bit higher so that we have 50%, and that way all of our particles will at least be vibrating 50% of the value above it, which is currently set to 3. And that way we don't have any smaller amounts, and we can basically adjust the variation between our vibration with the vibration minimum. And I'll set that to 0% so that we have a little more full effect. And underneath the vibration we also have 2 different thresholds, and we'll take a look at those a little bit later as well, along with a lot of our other settings. But first I want to change our vibration down to 0. And let's take a look at this target. This will allow us to target any object within the scene. And basically what that's going to do is create a velocity towards the object, and also shrink the generator down, or basically our particles overall, towards that object. So now we can select our current objects in the scene, which is itself, the light, and the camera. I'm going to add in a custom object for this. I'm going to go to the items, select load, and add objects null. And now we just have a null object in the scene. I'm going to set our position and just go ahead and move this null object outside of our emitter. Go back and we can select our effects emitter once again. Go back to motion and select our target as null. Now if we scrub through our scene, we can start to see that all of these are going to be attracted towards that object, and then once they go through them, they'll start to break up again. So we can do a lot of cool things with animation using this method of the target object. And I'm going to go ahead and just close out the effects browser and the object properties, and we're just going to create a little bit of an animation, which is some keyframes. I'm going to scrub through to the last frame in our animation and move our null object over just a little bit in the scene. I also have auto key create on, which is going to automatically create our keyframes. And I'm going to move to frame 150, about halfway into the animation, and just kind of move that null over. Go to frame 75, move it up. Go to frame 225 and move this down. So now we have a little bit of motion and change between our null, and we can hit play and just sort of watch this animation and how our particles are moving because they are targeted directly onto this null object. Now also keep in mind that we will want to calculate these particle effects. If I open up our object properties and select our Partigon emitter, we have a calculate button that is located on the top. And this will allow us to calculate the effect. This is extremely important for working with collision objects and multiple particles within our scene, and also network rendering. If you're going to be working with network rendering, you need to have a calculated particle that is also going to be saved. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later. First, let's go ahead and just calculate this. Calculating is also going to give us a little bit of a different look at our particles. They will look a lot different when you calculate than when you just normally scrub through the animation. And that's because when you're scrubbing through, it's just kind of using the settings that we currently have to make an approximation of what those particles will move and look like. And same thing with any of our different effects. Once we calculate, then it's going to use exact values and really figure out the dynamics and how the motion should look. I'm going to open back up our object properties and we can take a look at the effects emitter. And now that this is calculated, what we can do is go to the File tab and save our motion. This gives us the ability to save out all of these different particles on this object and then load them on to other emitters, and also allows the network to immediately access the particle effect. And that way each computer won't have to calculate the particle effect while it's rendering, because some processors will actually calculate a little bit differently. And this way you don't need to spend processing power on calculations of particles when you can spend it directly on rendering. So all we would need to do is save our motion, and that will automatically apply that to our effects emitter. And then at any time we could also load that motion in, and also load in other motions that we have saved. So there's a lot we can do with that. And we can also copy and paste these different settings onto other emitters. And then we also have a playback mode, which we'll take a look at a little bit later once we actually save out some particle effects, where we can change the playback speed and the load limit settings, and also the playback mode. The next tab we're going to take a look at is ETC, etc. And we have gravity options, center position, position blur, parent motion, max speed, loop frames if we want to be looping that motion of particles for certain looping effects, and also the record step frame, which we can change the value from 1 to a little bit higher. And there's a lot we can do with these different settings, and we're not going to focus on that too much right now. I'm going to go back to the motion, set this to none, so we no longer have this calculating or going towards our target. I'll select our null and we can remove it from the scene. And now let's go back to the ETC tab and take a look at gravity. This is going to work basically the same way as our velocity, except it will work a little bit differently. So let's change to -2, and we can take a look at the difference between using velocity at -2 and using gravity. Now we can see immediately that our resistance is off, so we'll go ahead and set that to 1. Turn that back on, but we're really not seeing that overall effect of resistance, how it was slowing down before. And that's because gravity works a lot differently than the velocity. Velocity is going to sort of spit out the particles, and that is going to be our force, is coming from the nozzle, and eventually they will slow down because of that. With gravity, it is a constant effect that is going to affect our particles throughout the animation. So we can see with -2 for our gravity, we have a constant falling of our particles. If I change that to 0, go to motion, and set our velocity to -2, then we're going to see that resistance on our particles. And that's the major difference between the velocity. The velocity is going to basically be spraying them out or shooting them out kind of like a shotgun, and then they will slow down. And then we also have the gravity, which is going to be a constant effect. We could change our center position, set that to 1, and let's do 2 on the Y. And now we're not really seeing too much of that at this moment because of the way our scene is set up, and we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Rotation is another option we have, and we can set this to align to path and also random rotation and scale. At this point, that's not going to matter too much with just the particle object itself. Align to path will definitely affect our object if we have an animation in our scene, but most of these settings will be when we're using the effects linker, which we'll also take a look at a little bit later. If we move on to the next tab, which is our interaction tab, we have self-interaction, pushing, bouncing, drag, and crowd, which is going to affect the interaction between our particles and itself, and also its overall interaction. So let's go ahead and change self-interaction to bounce and interaction to bounce. We can calculate. Now we're not really seeing anything because we don't have anything in the scene. So if you need to calculate or cancel your calculation, you can hit the Control key, which will remove that. Go back to the motion, and I'm going to set a bit of explosion. Hit calculate, and now we can see that coming out in the scene. And basically, as our particles hit each other, they will kind of bounce off, and we'll have that nice interaction between each of the different particles. I'm going to set that back to none right now. And now we're going to start taking a look at using these particles along with some of the more global options that we have, which are the wind and gravity within our scene. And then we're going to come back and take a look at some more advanced options of creating our particles and a lot of the different effects we can apply to them.